Welcome to another AI pattern recognition deep dive.
Today, we are tackling, well, a really big subject. It's historically charged, intellectually quite profound, and it's manifesting right now in, arguably, the most powerful technology we've ever created.
Mm.
We are diving deep into a stack of sources that raise a serious, frankly unsettling concern. The historical pattern known as the Eugenics Crusade, and its alarming ability to be learned, amplified, and operationalized by artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and what's really essential for you, the listener, to grasp right from the start is how this threat is framed in the material we looked at. When people hear eugenics, often the mind goes to, identifying some secret nefarious group or maybe a specific political figure.
Right, looking for the villain.
Exactly. But our sources argued that focusing so narrowly is actually dangerously misleading. It misses the real point.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The core idea, the premise really unifying all the material we reviewed, is that the true danger of eugenics isn't some shadowy organization. It's not even a set of, physical traits to avoid. It's an ideological pattern.
A pattern, yes. A kind of pseudoscientific framework that powerful pattern recognition technology like AI can inadvertently learn, operationalize, and then crucially amplify far beyond any human scale.
So it's like a cognitive flaw we humans have.
Right, that tendency to confuse correlation with causation. We see two things happen together and we assume one causes the other.
And AI is just brilliant at finding those connections, those patterns.
Brilliant at it. But if we feed it data that's already steeped in historical bias, well, it just replicates that bias with incredible algorithmic efficiency. It doesn't know it's bias, it just sees a pattern.
So our mission today is to trace this exact ideological power. We're going to start way back with the historical roots, late 19th century pseudoscience, and follow that thread right into its modern form, as ubiquitous algorithmic bias. We need to show you exactly how today's tech can end up applying the same kind of selective prejudice criteria to people, mirroring that old historical goal of categorizing and marginalizing those someone decided were unfit.
It's a deep dive into how bad logic, bad ideas can survive and even scale up dramatically with new tools.
So when people first encounter the history of eugenics, often the reflex is to sort of categorize it as an aberration, right? Something that happened in specific dark corners of history. Maybe Nazi Germany comes to mind immediately.
Yeah, you want to put it in a box, label it evil, and assume it was content to them, the obvious bad guys.
Exactly. And they want to identify the specific people or groups who were the eugenics, like it was a formal club or something.
But that desire, that need to compartmentalize it, maybe make it feel like a secret fringe movement. That's what the sources say is the fundamental misconception. If you're just looking for an identifiable them, you completely miss the pattern.
Precisely. Because the historical reality is eugenics was anything but secret. It was massive. It was publicly endorsed. It was institutionally sanctioned, especially in Western countries.
Wow, so not hidden at all. Not at all. Its core ideas were deeply embedded in law, in policy, across popular culture for decades. Its power didn't come from being hidden. It came from providing this seemingly scientific, rational justification, a kind of veneer of objectivity for prejudices that already existed in society. Prejudices about race, class, mental ability.
And this all sort of formally traces back to 1883 with the British scholar Francis Galton, right?
That's the key starting point for the modern movement. Galton, who interestingly was Charles Darwin's cousin, coined the term eugenics. It comes from the Greek eugenes, which means something like good in birth or good in stock.
And he was trying to apply Darwin's ideas.
He was really trying to apply these exciting new biological concepts, Darwin's natural selection, Mendel's heredity laws to human society. How can we improve the human race using science? That was the question.
But the way he applied them was, well, fundamentally flawed from the get-go, based on prejudice.
Completely flawed, absolutely. Galton observed physical heredity, things like eye color being passed down, and he incorrectly jumped to assuming that complex, abstract social traits like intelligence or moral character or even economic success worked the same way.
Like they were simple genetic traits you could breed for.
Exactly. He claimed these were simple hereditary units that could be controlled, managed to improve the human population. And, of course, this concept was absolutely saturated with the biases of his time. Victorian England, ideas about class, empire. He basically argued that only specific groups, often Nordic or Anglo-Saxon types, had the superior hereditary characteristics.
It's important to remember, though, that the basic idea society trying to selectively breed its members, that wasn't totally new with Galton. even if you put a scientific spin on it.
That's a really good point. The impulse is ancient. You can find precursors way back with the Greek philosopher Plato. In the Republic, he discusses similar concepts. Selective breeding to create an ideal, stable state.
But Galton gave it the modern scientific gloss.
He formalized it, yeah. He gave it this institutional credibility that the modern scientific era was really hungry for. Made it seem objective, data-driven.
And once it was formalized, this movement kind of split into two main approaches, didn't it?
Yeah.
Both aiming for social engineering, really.
That's right. Two distinct but connected tracks. The first was positive eugenics. This was the more socially acceptable side, the public-facing part. It focused on encouraging reproduction among those people deemed genetically advantaged.
And the most visible example of that in the U.S. were those fitter family contests.
Oh, absolutely. Those contests, which actually grew out of better baby contests at state fairs, are so striking because they just completely normalized the whole idea. You had families literally being judged.
Like livestock.
Sometimes right alongside livestock exhibitions, yeah. They weren't judged on character or community contributions, but on their stock, their bloodlines. And the scoring criteria were incredibly specific, but also totally subjective. They used things like family history records, some early mental testing, physical appearance, and they awarded medals, public praise. It was a direct attempt to create a social climate that celebrated and incentivized one very specific demographic profile.
Which implicitly marginalizes everyone else as less fit, setting up an ideal template for the good American family.
Precisely. And if positive eugenics defined the ideal, well, then negative eugenics focused on what needed to be eliminated.
Okay, this is the darker side.
This was the much darker, coercive side, yeah. Negative eugenics aimed to eliminate traits considered unfit through systematic methods. Things like marriage prohibitions between certain groups, segregation, institutionalization, forced abortions, and, most notoriously, compulsory sterilization.
And the underlying logic.
The idea was that certain people, the poor, the disabled, certain ethnic groups, were a drain on society or a threat to the racial purity of the nation. And the state, armed with this new science, had not just a right, but an obligation to step in and prevent them from reproducing.
And that jump from just encouraging the fittest to actively eliminating the unfit, that's where this ideology really shifted from just a biased philosophy into something that caused scalable institutional harm, isn't it?
That's the critical transition, yes, from
Yep.
bad ideas to state-sanctioned action.
What's truly, shocking when you dig into this and what our sources really hammer home is the level of institutional buy-in this ideology achieved. This wasn't some fringe view held by a few extremists in basements.
No, not at all. It was practically the consensus position among the educated elite class in the early 20th century. You had leading figures championing it.
Like who?
Well, prominent zoologists like Charles B. Davenport, who actually founded the Eugenics Record Office, which was the central hub for all this biased research. Leading plant geneticists lent their credibility, showing how scientists from totally different fields got on board.
So it had cross-disciplinary scientific backing, seemingly.
It did. And perhaps most tellingly, you had U.S. President Calvin Coolidge publicly endorsing the movement and its goals. This was mainstream.
It seems like the core appeal for these figures, especially in the progressive era, was this idea of efficiency, wasn't it? The notion that society could be scientifically managed, improved, just like you'd manage a farm or a factory.
That's exactly it. The progressive era was fascinated with scientific management, efficiency, progress, and eugenics presented itself as the ultimate form of social engineering. It promised an efficient way to eliminate persistent social problems: poverty, crime, perceived moral weakness, all under this banner of biological inevitability. Science says this is the way.
And that broad elite support gave the ideology the institutional muscle it needed to actually translate prejudice into enforceable law.
Absolutely. And the key turning point in the U.S. where it moved from theory to law came surprisingly early.
Indiana, right, 1907.
That's right. Indiana passed the very first compulsory sterilization law in 1907. This was a direct state-sanctioned policy. It targeted people in institutions who were labeled idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, along with certain types of criminals.
And that Indiana law became the model.
It became the national blueprint, yeah. Showed it was legally possible. And by the 1930s, over 30 states had followed suit with similar legislation.
The scale of this state-sanctioned harm is just staggering. Our sources confirm over 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized across the U.S. But we really have to stress this wasn't applied randomly or neutrally, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. It was a tool of systemic social control, plain and simple. The sterilization programs disproportionately targeted ethnic minorities, the poor, people institutionalized for disabilities, those with mental illness. It was a clear-cut example of using medical pseudoscience to enforce the existing social and racial hierarchy.
And this practice, this horrifying practice, was legally cemented at the highest level, 1927, the Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell.
Yes, Buck v. Bell is absolutely pivotal because it gave these state sterilization laws the ultimate stamp of legal legitimacy. The Supreme Court upheld a Virginia statute that allowed the compulsory sterilization of people in institutions, specifically in the case of Carrie Buck.
This was the moment the U.S. legal system basically said, yes, negative eugenics is constitutional.
Officially sanctioned it, and the words used by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for the court's majority, they are just chillin'. We should probably read the key part of the quote just to grasp the mindset at the time.
Okay, he wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind."
Wow. I mean, that quote is just the ultimate distillation of the eugenic mindset, isn't it? You have flawed pseudoscience leading directly to legal justification, which then enables scalable, permanent, state-approved harm. It explicitly frames certain human beings as disposable burdens, manifestly unfit.
And beyond controlling individual reproduction, eugenics was also wielded to control who even got into the country, right? It fueled immigration restrictions.
Absolutely. It provided the core intellectual justification for the really restrictive Immigration Act of 1924, often called the Johnson-Reed Act.
How so?
Well, that law was explicitly designed as a racial engineering project. It drastically cut immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and almost completely banned immigration from Asia. And crucially, the quotas it set, they were based on the 1890 census data.
Why 1890?
Because that specific year's census reflected a population makeup dominated by Northern European and Anglo-Saxon stock. They deliberately chose that historical data point to preserve what eugenicists saw as the superior Nordic racial composition of the country. It was using data to cement a racial hierarchy through immigration policy.
This systematic legal movement in the U.S., it eventually found its most horrific expression overseas, didn't it?
Yes, it's a hard truth, but German racial hygiene programs drew direct inspiration from the American legal and scientific movements. They looked at the scale of American sterilization laws, the legal backing from cases like Buck v. Bell, and saw it as a model for what was possible.
So the Nazis learned from the U.S. experience.
They explicitly cited it. Just 2 years after the Nazis came to power, they introduced their own law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring in 1933. That led to the sterilization of roughly 360,000 people in Germany.
And that campaign?
Yeah.
It didn't stop at sterilization.
No, it escalated terrifyingly quickly. It culminated first in the T4 program. This was the systematic, state-run murder of disabled people and others deemed life unworthy of life within institutions. And those methods, those techniques, were then scaled up for the atrocities of the Holocaust.
The T4 program was like a test run.
A horrific test run for mass extermination. The lesson here is stark. The historical pattern involves using flawed data, whether it's flawed biological assumptions or skewed census data, to justify massive social engineering and exclusion. The moment a society accepts the basic premise that some groups of people can be categorized as unfit, the path towards atrocity really opens up.
And that brings us right to the present day, because that core pattern, using flawed data, confusing correlation with cause to justify social engineering, here's where it gets really interesting and frankly quite scary. We see this exact same logic reemerging in modern AI systems. Okay, so we've established that eugenics isn't really about finding a specific group of villains. It's about spotting a pattern of flawed thinking, using observed data, often biased data, to make these huge prejudice decisions about human worth.
So how does AI, which is fundamentally a pattern recognition tool, inherit this exact flaw? How does bad genes become bad data?
The connection is right there in the core intellectual mistake they both make, confusing correlation with causation and then basing really high-stakes decisions on that confusion.
Right.
Historically, eugenicists saw a correlation like maybe poverty seemed more common in certain immigrant communities, and they incorrectly jumped to declaring it a genetic cause. They claimed those groups just had bad stock. They ignored all the environmental factors, discrimination, lack of opportunity. Can you give us an analogy to really nail this down? Correlation versus causation.
Sure, think about this. You observe that ice cream sales go up at the same time that incidents of heat stroke go up. An algorithm, or just a simple analysis, notes the correlation. They rise together.
Okay.
Now, a flawed eugenicist-style logic might argue that eating ice cream causes heat stroke. But that's wrong, obviously.
Right. There's a hidden factor.
Exactly. The external variable, the hot weather, is causing both things to increase. The correlation is real, but the causal link is wrong. In AI, if the training data is soaked in historical injustice, the algorithm might observe a strong correlation between, say, poor credit scores and certain minority zip codes.
And so the AI assumes that living in that zip code or being part of that demographic is the cause of the higher risk, not the history of things like redlining or systemic economic disadvantage that actually created that situation.
Precisely. The algorithm mistakes those environmental systemic factors for inherent predictive characteristics of the people themselves. It makes the same kind of logical leap the eugenicists did, only now the genes are data points. The lineage goes straight from Galton's flawed idea of hereditary genius right down to a modern AI making discriminatory judgments about who deserves a loan or a job interview or maybe even their freedom.
And this dangerous pattern shows up in AI systems through basically three key mechanisms that end up encoding historical prejudice into decisions that shape our future. Let's start with the most obvious one: bias baked into the data itself.
Right. The first mechanism is fundamental. Bias in the data. AI models learn from data sets, and these data sets are essentially historical records of human decisions, human behavior. And guess what? Those records are full of our historical biases.
So back to the hiring example. An AI is trained on decades of data about who got hired and promoted in, say, a traditionally male-dominated engineering field.
Okay, so the AI learns that people historically labeled successful in that field often went to certain universities, maybe played certain sports like rugby, or used certain kinds of male-coded language in their resumes.
The AI isn't intentionally sexist. It's just trying to predict future success by looking at what worked, according to the data in the past.
Exactly right. But if that input data only reflects a biased, male-dominated history, the algorithm learns to score female candidates lower, even if they're equally or more qualified based on objective skills. The AI is just reproducing historical discrimination, but now it's doing it instantly at massive scale, and the exclusion it creates can look objective, mathematical, even meritocratic.
Which leads us to the second mechanism, which is maybe a bit more subtle: the use of proxy data.
Yeah, proxy data is where the system uses inputs that seem neutral on the surface, but actually act as stand-ins, as proxies, for protected characteristics like race or gender or disability status.
So just like historical eugenicists might have used something like skull shape, or where someone lived as a proxy for their supposed moral worth.
Modern AI might use things like your internet browsing history, the type of device you're using, maybe even your location data derived from your phone.
So you might explicitly tell the algorithm not to use race, but you feed it someone's postal code, which we know is often highly correlated with racial demographics. Or maybe you feed it the time of day someone applies for a loan, which could correlate with socioeconomic status if, say, only people with certain jobs can apply during banking hours.
Exactly. We see this a lot in financial services. They'll scrupulously avoid using race directly, but they might use the type of web browser or phone you have. If historical data shows that, say, lower-income minority groups disproportionately use older, slower Android devices compared to newer iPhones, the algorithm might learn to assign a slightly higher risk score to applicants using those Android devices.
Creating a discriminatory outcome without ever explicitly mentioning race.
Precisely. It's often called data leakage. The bias leaks through these seemingly benign features.
And the third mechanism, this one sounds particularly insidious because it's self-perpetuating: the feedback loop.
The feedback loop. Yeah, this is essentially the digital equivalent of social engineering. What happens is, if an AI makes a biased decision, and the outcome of that decision is then fed back into the system as new training data, well, the system starts to amplify its own initial prejudice exponentially.
It becomes a closed loop, a self-reinforcing echo chamber of its own bias.
Exactly. Let's revisit that predictive policing example. An algorithm uses historical arrest data, which, let's be clear, already reflects historical patterns of where police chose to patrol heavily.
Often in minority neighborhoods.
Right. So the algorithm uses this data and predicts future crime hotspots in those same neighborhoods. So what happens? Police resources get directed there even more disproportionately.
And because there are more police there.
They make more arrests, often for minor infractions that might be ignored elsewhere, even if the actual underlying crime rates are similar across different neighborhoods.
And that new skewed arrest data,
gets fed back into the AI as ground truth. It confirms the algorithm's initial biased prediction. So the system says, see, I was right, and tells the police to send even more resources to those areas next time. The system doesn't just predict inequality, it actively manufactures and deepens it.
That directly mirrors the negative eugenics goal of systematically marginalizing or eliminating undesirable groups by controlling where they live, where they work, maybe even who they reproduce with.
It's the same pattern of using data to sort and control populations.
So the chilling conclusion from this part of our deep dive is, the danger isn't really that AI will somehow magically rediscover eugenics on its own. The danger is that if we feed it our flawed historical data, the AI becomes the most powerful, efficient, and scalable vehicle ever invented to carry out that old eugenic pattern, all while masking it in the language of mathematical neutrality.
Precisely. The pattern finds a new, powerful host. So if we follow that parallel through, the people who were labeled unfit by the old eugenicists, the idiots, the feeble-minded, the modern equivalent might be the statistically disadvantaged or maybe the algorithmically inconvenient.
Right. The flawed metrics used back then to justify sterilization, they've just been replaced by digital metrics now. Metrics that create these implicit, maybe more subtle, but still profoundly damaging forms of exclusion.
And because these decisions are buried inside complex, often proprietary algorithms, they're incredibly hard for the person who's harmed to even understand, let alone challenge.
Yeah, the exclusion gets framed as just a technical output. The computer says no, not as a potentially prejudiced decision.
Yeah.
So we really need to categorize the specific ways this algorithmic harm happens, clearly for our listener.
Yeah.
How does the data actually fail?
Okay, we can break down the core mechanisms of bias, the ways the data leads the AI astray, into maybe three main types. First, there's selection bias. This is pretty straightforward. The data used to train the AI simply doesn't accurately represent the real world it's supposed to operate in. The way the data was selected or gathered was flawed.
Can you give us a clear example of the consequences of selection bias, maybe beyond the usual facial recognition ones?
Sure, think about developing autonomous vehicles. If the training data used to teach the car to recognize pedestrians mostly contains images collected in, say, sunny California, featuring people with lighter skin tones wearing typical summer clothing,
Okay.
that system might perform poorly, have higher error rates when it encounters a situation it wasn't trained on. Maybe trying to detect a construction worker in reflective gear at twilight, or a person with much darker skin walking in the rain in a different city.
So it's not just a failure of recognition, it could lead to actual physical harm.
Absolutely. Based purely on who was or wasn't selected to be represented in the training data.
Okay, the second type is confirmation bias. This is where the AI leans too heavily on existing, flawed historical data and ends up actively reinforcing those past prejudices.
Exactly. The Amazon hiring algorithm we mentioned is the classic case study here. It confirmed the historical prejudice present in Amazon's own hiring data. It learned that past success, meaning getting hired or promoted, correlated strongly with male candidates. So it started penalizing resumes that mentioned things like women's chess club or colleges known to be historically female.
It was just learning the bias status quo.
Precisely. Confirming what was already there. And finally, there's outgroup homogeneity bias.
What's that one?
This is when the AI essentially generalizes individuals from groups that are underrepresented in the data. It treats them as if they're all more or less the same, which increases the chance of misclassifying them or failing to distinguish between them.
So that's why many facial recognition systems struggle more with differentiating between individuals within certain racial or ethnic minority groups compared to the majority group.
That's a major factor, yes. The system often lacks enough varied data, enough fidelity for those underrepresented groups, so it can't make those fine-grained distinctions as reliably. It tends to see the outgroup as a more homogenized mass.
And these mechanisms, selection bias, confirmation bias, outgroup homogeneity, they aren't just theoretical concepts. They create direct, real-world algorithmic parallels to historical eugenic practices, especially in sectors that control our opportunities and life outcomes.
Yeah, let's look at those parallels directly. Start with hiring and recruitment. This is like the modern version of positive eugenics, selecting the supposedly fittest stock for economic opportunity.
Right, like the Amazon tool functionally excluding women.
Exactly. That wasn't some random technical glitch. It was the algorithm perfectly reproducing historical bias. And the result is it artificially limits the pool of talent, excludes entire demographics based on flawed historical metrics dressed up as predictors of success.
Okay, now shift to healthcare. This seems to run parallel to negative eugenics, maybe even the sterilization aspect, because bias here can literally be a matter of life and death.
It absolutely can. There was a hugely influential healthcare risk prediction algorithm used across the U.S. healthcare system on, reportedly, over 200 million people. Its goal was to identify patients who needed extra proactive care management programs.
Sounds good in theory.
In theory. But investigations found it was significantly less effective for Black patients. And here's the crucial, damning detail. The algorithm used historical healthcare spending as its main proxy for medical need.
Wait, spending equals need. How does that work?
Well, it doesn't work well if there's systemic inequity because of deeply entrenched issues like doctors historically spending less time with Black patients, offering fewer invasive procedures, scheduling fewer follow-ups, maybe due to implicit bias or structural barriers. The historical spending data was lower for Black patients, even when they were actually sicker than white patients with similar conditions.
So the algorithm sees lower spending in the past and concludes those Black patients must be healthier. They must need less care.
Exactly. It interpreted a failure of the system, the historical inequity in care delivery, as a biological or behavioral truth about the patient's lack of need. And the result? These sicker Black patients were assigned lower risk scores by the algorithm.
Which meant they were denied access to beneficial care management programs.
While care was prioritized for historically more privileged white patients who, because the system had spent more on them historically, looked needier to the algorithm. It's a purely digital mechanism for allocating scarce healthcare resources based directly on past bias. Utterly devastating.
And finally, let's look at law enforcement injustice. This seems like the clearest parallel to those restrictive, racially motivated policies like the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. We have to talk about the COMPASS algorithm.
Yeah. Right, the COMPASS algorithm. It's widely used in U.S. courts, pretrial services, parole boards. Its purpose is to calculate the likelihood that a defendant will commit another crime in the future, their recidivism risk. It spits out a score, often 1 to 10.
And the problem.
Investigative journalists, particularly from ProPublica, did a deep dive. They looked at defendants who were scored by COMPASS and then tracked what actually happened. What they found was stark. When looking specifically at defendants who did not go on to commit a future crime, Black defendants were incorrectly labeled as high risk, a false positive, at nearly twice the rate of white defendants.
So Black people who were not going to reoffend were flagged as dangerous much more often.
Much more often. And conversely, when looking at defendants who did actually reoffend later, white defendants were more likely to have been incorrectly labeled low risk by COMPASS, a false negative compared to Black defendants.
Wow. So the algorithm was systematically over-predicting risk for one group and under-predicting it for another, reinforcing the very stereotypes it was supposed to be objective about.
It absolutely creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a Black defendant who is actually low risk gets labeled high risk by the algorithm, they might face higher bail, making it harder to keep their job or housing while awaiting trial. They might get a harsher sentence based on that score. They face increased surveillance upon release. All of this feeds back into that predictive policing loop we talked about earlier.
It institutionalizes bias in a way that directly limits the freedom, movement, and future opportunities of minority populations, doesn't it? Just like historical laws restricted immigration or mandated sterilization based on perceived group traits.
It's the same pattern of using flawed data to categorize and control.
So let's step back. Who is actually benefiting from this algorithmic stratification, and who is most consistently put at risk?
Well, the groups most at risk are, depressingly predictably, the same groups historically targeted by eugenicists. Ethnic and racial minorities, people with disabilities, the economically disadvantaged, women in certain contexts. They suffer concrete harm, limitations on access to capital, jobs, housing, fair treatment in the justice system, even healthcare, all mediated by technology that was often designed without sufficient thought to ethical guardrails or historical context.
And the beneficiaries.
The beneficiaries tend to be those who design, implement, and profit from these automated systems. It often reinforces existing economic and power structures, partly because it makes the resulting inequalities seem less like the outcome of biased choices and more like the unavoidable result of neutral technology. Makes the status quo seem inevitable.
And our sources also raise this really unnerving future prospect, the idea of a genetic overclass emerging, not just from bias data, but from actual biotechnological interventions.
Yeah, this is kind of the ultimate extrapolation of the eugenic pattern into the future. As technologies like CRISPR gene editing become more sophisticated and accessible, at least to some,
The wealthy.
Primarily the wealthy, yes. They may increasingly be able to afford technological enhancements or interventions aimed at selecting subjectively desirable traits for their children. Now, imagine if AI systems are used to manage access to these enhancements, or if AI systems in hiring, education, or finance start disproportionately rewarding individuals who possess these technologically improved characteristics.
You could see a new, potentially permanent form of social stratification.
Exactly. Those who can afford the enhancements pull further ahead, while those who cannot are left at an acute, algorithmically reinforced disadvantage. It wouldn't just be social or economic inequality, it could become a kind of digital genetic divide, a true overclass defined by access to both data and biological modification.
Okay, we've traced the parallel, we've looked at the mechanisms, we've seen the severe consequences in hiring, healthcare, justice. Now we really need to place this threat in context.
Yeah.
Just how dangerous is this pattern today? Our sources push us to make a distinction here between what they call global catastrophic risks, GCRs, and existential risks, X risks.
Yeah, that distinction is important. It's crucial not to, overinflate the threat beyond its actual scope, even while we fully acknowledge how profound and damaging it is. Historical eugenics, for example, was absolutely a horrific global catastrophic risk, a GCR, meaning
Right.
it caused immense suffering, death, demographic devastation on a massive global scale. Terrible harm. However, it didn't actually cause the extinction of the human species or a permanent, unrecoverable collapse of civilization itself.
Right. And X risks, existential risks, are defined as those threats that could do that end humanity's potential for a long and prosperous future. Things like an unaligned artificial superintelligence, maybe nuclear winter, runaway climate change, threats that could cause total civilizational collapse.
Exactly. So where does the modern manifestation of these eugenic patterns via AI fit in? The conclusion from the sources is that it's a profound threat to the quality of human existence, to human dignity, to justice. It absolutely risks algorithmically sorting society, entrenching inequality for generations, maybe even creating that bio-digital overclass. It's a fundamental challenge to our social compact.
But it's not, on its own, likely to cause human extinction.
Probably not an X risk in itself, no. That said, its ability to erode democratic principles, fuel social instability, and deepen divisions absolutely makes it a global catastrophic risk of the highest order. It degrades the foundations needed to tackle other X risks.
Okay, so the challenge remains. How do we fight an ideological pattern, especially one that algorithms can disguise as objective neutral math?
Oh,
We already rejected that initial impulse to just look for a specific group of people to blame.
right. And the solution, historically and now, has to be about rejecting the fundamental premise, the very idea of categorizing people by arbitrary traits, whether it's skull shape or zip code, and assigning them different worth based on that. The ideology of eugenics wasn't ultimately defeated by finding and prosecuting every single person who believed in it.
How was it defeated then?
It was defeated by a profound moral and legal rejection of its core tenets worldwide, especially after the full, horrific scope of the Nazi atrocities came to light after World War II. We combat the ideology, not just the individuals who hold it at any given moment.
And since the problem today is systemic, embedded in data, in algorithms, and institutions, the solution has to be systemic too. It requires what the sources call a new social compact, one that tackles technology, policy, and education all at once. It can't just be a technical fix.
Absolutely not. It has to start with robust policy and governance. We need specific, enforceable regulatory frameworks that ensure human responsibility and accountability are baked into AI development and deployment. Generic calls for AI ethics are nice, but they're not enough, especially for a knowledgeable audience like yours. We need concrete actions.
Okay, so what are some of those concrete policy solutions being actively explored or implemented globally right now to fight algorithmic bias?
Well, one of the most important tools being pushed is the mandated use of algorithmic impact assessments, or AIAs. The idea is before a government agency or even a large company deploys an AI system in a critical area like hiring, credit scoring, parole decisions, resource allocation, they must conduct a thorough, preferably public, risk assessment.
What would that assessment involve?
It would have to detail potential biases in the data, identify potential proxy variables that could lead to discrimination, analyze the potential harm to marginalized groups, and outline mitigation strategies. It forces transparency before deployment.
And are there moves to just ban certain AI applications altogether?
Yes, absolutely. Regulatory frameworks like the EU AI Act, which is pioneering a lot of this, are moving towards banning specific high-risk AI applications outright. Things like real-time biometric identification in public spaces by law enforcement, or systems that use behavioral data for broad social scoring like you see in some countries. The idea is some applications just present an unacceptable risk to fundamental rights and human dignity, full stop.
Okay, so policy sets the rules of the road. But what about the developers themselves? What do they need to do differently to tackle things like data leakage or confirmation bias at the technical level?
Technical solutions demand much more proactive diligence than we've often seen. Developers absolutely must work harder to diversify their training data sets, make them truly representative of the populations the AI will affect. And they need to employ adversarial auditing techniques, maybe hiring independent external auditors, or even using competing AI models specifically designed to sniff out and neutralize bias before the product ships.
And what about human oversight?
Crucially, yes. Especially in high-stakes areas like healthcare and justice, AI systems have to be designed with a human firmly in the loop. There needs to be a clear point for human review, human judgment, and crucially, a human veto. The algorithm should serve as a tool to inform or suggest, not as the final, unquestionable authority making life-altering decisions.
Okay, policy and tech solutions. Finally, the third leg of this stool has to be robust public education, right? Because if people just see AI as this infallible oracle, they won't question its outputs.
Exactly. The public desperately needs critical AI literacy and data literacy. People need to be taught from school age onwards to view AI not as magic, but as a powerful yet inherently flawed tool. A tool that has inherited our own messy, biased history through the data it learns from.
So it's about cultivating critical thinking skills.
Yes. Skills to question the input data. Where did it come from? Whose perspective does it represent? Question the process. How does this algorithm actually work, at least conceptually? And question the output. Does this result make sense? Does it feel fair? Does it align with our values? We ultimately combat the ideology by strengthening our whole society's immune system against that flawed logic of confusing correlation with causation.
But thinking about AI's strengths, if it is so brilliant at pattern recognition, could it actually be used for good here? Could AI itself help us fight these patterns of historical bias instead of just perpetuating them?
That's a really important question, and the answer is potentially yes. We can try to leverage ethical AI as a corrective force. Now, AI isn't going to magically convince a prejudiced person to change their deeply held beliefs, probably.
Right.
But it can help combat the spread of biased information and disinformation that fuels prejudice. Think about AI as a fact-checking tool. It can get very good very quickly at identifying things like deepfakes or flagging coordinated misinformation campaigns online, freeing up human journalists and researchers for deeper analysis.
And could it help us audit our own history for bias?
Absolutely. That's a really powerful potential use. AI excels at finding subtle patterns in vast data sets. We could use it to audit historical records like decades of mortgage lending data or old court sentencing records, or university admission patterns to reveal systemic biases and inequities that might have been completely invisible or at least deniable through manual human review alone.
So using AI to find the evidence of past bias needed to justify corrective action today.
Exactly. And furthermore, in education, we shouldn't just see AI as a tool for students to get quick answers. We could use it as a partner in critical inquiry. Imagine using AI to generate complex simulated scenarios, maybe ethical dilemmas or historical counterfactuals, and then tasking students with using their own evidence-based reasoning, their empathy, their moral judgment to navigate those scenarios. It forces development of uniquely human strengths. #outro.
So to really summarize our deep dive today, the true eugenics crusade, if you want to call it that, of the 21st century isn't necessarily a shadowy group plotting in secret. It's the unexamined, often unintentional, use of data and algorithms that end up applying selective biased criteria to human beings on a massive scale.
Yeah, the threat has shifted, hasn't it? From that overt, legally mandated harm of the past to something more subtle, more insidious, or perhaps algorithmically mediated exclusion. Exclusion that quietly reinforces existing biases, undermines justice, and carries that real risk of creating a permanent social stratification based on digital access and historical advantage. And the ultimate defense, as we've discussed, it's probably not going to be some perfect, bias-free algorithm that might even be impossible to achieve.
Right.
It's more about a societal commitment. a commitment to ethical design principles, to mandatory transparency about how these systems work, and critically, to fostering a public that is empowered and encouraged to critically question the narratives and the data that shape their world.
It's about embedding the hard-won moral lessons of the 20th century into the very code, the very DNA of the technologies shaping the 21st.
By establishing these robust, concrete ethical frameworks, demanding public accountability, ensuring human oversight, that's how we demonstrate that humanity has learned, or is trying to learn, the profound and difficult lessons of the past.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? Well, maybe the fundamental challenge is this. If AI is truly brilliant at pattern recognition, and if the core historical pattern of eugenics is that fundamental error of confusing correlation with causation, mistaking data links for definitive inherent truths about people, then how can you start using your own newly strengthened critical thinking skills to audit the invisible correlations being presented to you every day by the algorithms that govern so much of your life?
Yeah.
Look closely at the systems determining the news you read, the content you see online, maybe even the job ads or loan offers you receive. Question the data that's being used to define your world and the conclusions being drawn from it. That's definitely something to mull over or maybe explore further on your own.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
We'll see you soon.
This is DigitView.